Let's begin a long, slow journey backwards. Not just a few years or even centuries, but thousands upon thousands of years, to a time before nations, before the maps we know, before so much of what we consider history even began. We are going to travel to the very dawn of organized human life, to the place where our story of civilization first whispered itself into being. Find a comfortable position and let your mind begin to drift toward that distant past. This story does not start with a bang or a sudden discovery. It was not born in a single moment of genius. Instead, imagine it as a slow, gradual gathering, a convergence of countless small necessities and gentle environmental gifts. Picture, if you will, a wide, flat land under a vast, open sky. A land defined not by mountains or dense forests, but by two great, winding rivers. They flow side by side, like the veins of the earth itself, carrying not just water, but possibility. This is the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. What made this place so special? Why here of all the spots on the globe? Think of those rivers as life givers. Every year, in a predictable rhythm, they would swell and overflow their banks. And when they receded, they left behind a secret gift, a fine, rich, dark silt. This wasn't just mud. It was a blanket of fertility packed with minerals that plants craved. The sun-baked, arid plains were, season after season, transformed into a lush, green haven. The soil was so generous, it could produce abundant crops year after year, without the need for people to move on. Can you imagine the realization dawning on those first people? That they might not have to follow the herds or search for wild berries. That the food could come to them and stay? But the land offered more than just fertile ground. These rivers were also the first highways. They connected distant places, allowing not just water, but ideas, tools, and stories to travel. And the deserts that surrounded this fertile ribbon? They acted as a natural barrier, a kind of quiet wall that offered protection, funneling the world through this nurturing corridor. The stage, you could say, was perfectly set. All it needed were the actors. For millennia, the humans here lived as all humans did, in small, mobile bands. They hunted, they gathered, they followed the seasons. They possessed a deep, generational knowledge of this land. They knew which wild grasses had the fattest seeds, which plants could be trusted, where the water was sweetest. This knowledge was their greatest tool. And then a shift in the world's climate, the ending of a great ice age, brought warmer temperatures and more stable weather patterns. The uncertainties of survival lessened just a little. The growing seasons stretched longer. It was in this window of stability that a profound experiment began. Instead of just harvesting wild grains, what if they saved the very best seeds? What if they cleared a small patch of that miraculous riverside soil and placed those seeds deliberately into the earth? What if they tended them, protected them, and waited? This was the first quiet act of rebellion against mere chance. It was the beginning of farming, and with it came the first fragile notion of tomorrow. Because when you plant a seed, you are making a promise to the future. You are saying, I will be here when this grows. And so, the semi-permanent camp became a permanent settlement. The temporary shelter of hides and branches gave way to homes of mud brick, with rooms for sleeping, for storing the precious surplus grain, for crafts. This was a revolution in slow motion, taking centuries. But its implications were immediate. For the first time in human history, not every single person had to be directly involved in finding the day's food. This liberation of time and labor created something new: specialization. Some could now focus on shaping clay into sturdy pots, perfect for storing that grain. Others could weave reeds or early fabrics. Tools could be refined. With a stable home and a predictable food source, communities could grow larger. What was a band of 25 became a village of hundreds. And with more people living closely together, new questions arose. How do we share the water from the river fairly? How do we resolve disputes when we can't simply walk away? How do we organize the building of a wall or the digging of a canal? These were the first civic questions. The answers to them would become the blueprint for society itself. In places like Tel Esong, we see this early sophistication. A settlement not of haphazard huts, but of planned lanes. They dug intricate irrigation canals, a network of tiny arteries bringing life from the great river to each field. This was no small task. It required agreement, leadership, and shared labor. It required looking at a landscape and imagining what it could be, then working together to make that vision real. Think of the coordination that required. Someone had to understand the slope of the land, the flow of the water. Others had to dig, to reinforce the channels, to maintain them. This was engineering born from pure necessity, a collective intelligence taking shape. And as these communities flourished, another layer was added. With surplus grains safely stored, trade blossomed. A pot from one village could travel to another in exchange for fine stone tools. Patterns on pottery became more intricate, moving beyond function into something like art, a shared language of symbols and beauty. All of this emerged from that simple, revolutionary decision to plant a seed and stay. The chain of consequences was unbroken, from fertility to settlement to surplus to specialization to trade to art to complex social organization. The foundation was now firmly laid, stone by stone, brick by brick. But what would humanity build upon this foundation? The story was only just beginning, and the next chapters would see the rise of something the world had never seen before. Not just a village, but a city. The scale of human dreams was about to expand exponentially. But for now, let that image rest in your mind. A calm, green river valley at dawn. The first tendrils of smoke rising from simple, mud brick homes. The sound of water gently flowing through a human-made channel. A community, still small, waking to a day they had planned for, in a place they called their own. It is a peaceful, purposeful scene. The cradle is ready. What will it nurture? As the centuries gently turned, these flourishing villages began to dream in a new scale. The confidence born from successful harvests and well-maintained canals fueled an ambition that stretched beyond the horizon of a single settlement. The community's imagination grew alongside its granaries. Why stop at one village? Why not connect them, protect them, and pool their collective might? The concept of the city was stirring, a gathering of human energy so intense it would alter the very landscape. In the south of Mesopotamia, where the rivers broadened and the silt was deepest, one settlement began to distinguish itself. It started, like all others, as a humble cluster of homes by the Euphrates. But its location was fortunate, and its people were ambitious. We know it as Uruk. Around it, the fields grew ever wider, fed by canals that reached out like fingers into the fertile plain. More food supported more people. More people meant more specialists, more ideas, more power. Uruk began to swell, absorbing nearby communities, drawing in people with the magnetic pull of opportunity and security. By the time 30 centuries before our common era had passed, Uruk was no longer a town. It was a phenomenon, a sprawling metropolis of tens of thousands. Can you picture it? The largest human congregation the planet had ever witnessed. Such a concentration of life demanded new forms of order. You could not govern a city of thousands as you would a village of hundreds. The old ways, based on kinship and familiar faces, frayed under the pressure of anonymous crowds and complex trade. A new architecture of power was needed, not just of mud brick, but of ideas. And in Uruk, it emerged from two powerful sources, the divine and the practical. At the heart of the city, on ground made deliberately higher than the surrounding plain, rose massive platforms. And upon these platforms, temples were built. These were not simple shrines, but enormous complexes dedicated to the gods who were believed to own the city and its land. The most impressive was a towering, whitewashed temple, sitting atop its artificial mountain, a ziggurat. It dominated the skyline, a constant, brilliant white landmark visible for miles. Its construction was a statement. To build it required thousands of workers, organized over years. It required architects who understood weight and slope, foremen who could coordinate teams, and administrators who could feed and house the laborers. This was power made visible, and it was sacred power. The temple was more than a place of prayer. It was the city's economic engine. It owned vast tracts of land, managed herds of livestock, and operated workshops for weavers, potters, and metalworkers. It needed to keep records: how much grain was harvested from temple fields, how many sheep were sheared, how much oil was stored. And this practical, mundane need, accounting, triggered one of humanity's most profound leaps. The administrators of Uruk began to experiment with marks in clay. A simple pictogram of a sheep head meant sheep. A jar shape meant oil. Notches meant numbers. But as transactions grew more complex, so many jars of oil for so many bundles of wool delivered by such and such a person on a certain date, the system evolved. The sheep pictogram was simplified into a few quick wedge-shaped marks. The stylus met the clay, and a symbol was born. Then, a brilliant conceptual leap. These marks began to represent not just objects, but the sounds of words. This was the birth of true writing. Cuneiform, this wedge-shaped script, could now capture not just inventories, but names, prayers, laws, and stories. The human mind had found a way to externalize its thoughts, to speak across time and distance. It was quite simply magic. With writing came the need for scribes, a new class of educated specialists. And with the vast administrative needs of the temple and the growing city, a new kind of leader evolved from the priestly class, the En, or high priest, who served as the steward of the god's estate. His authority was religious, derived from his role as the intermediary between the people and the divine landlord. But what happened when danger came? When a rival city threatened, or when the canals needed defending from raiders? In times of crisis, the people turned to a different figure, the Lugal, the big man. His authority came not from ritual, but from proven strength and military success. Over time, these two roles, the spiritual steward and the martial protector, often merged into one. The successful Lugal would ensure his victories were blessed by the temple, and the En would rely on the Lugal for defense. Thus, the idea of kingship was forged, a fusion of divine mandate and earthly power. The king was not a god himself, as in Egypt, but the god's chosen representative, responsible for maintaining order, justice, and the all-important relationship with the forces that controlled the floodwaters and the harvest. This model of the city-state, a powerful urban center controlling surrounding farmland, ruled by a king who derived his authority from the gods, and administered by scribes using writing, proved incredibly successful. Uruk's template was copied. Other great cities rose along the rivers. Ur, with its access to the Persian Gulf and talent for exquisite metalwork. Lagash, a center of administration whose archives give us minute details of ancient economics. Nippur, the religious heartland where all cities acknowledged the supreme god Enlil. Each city was independent, fiercely proud, and often in competition with its neighbors for land, water, and prestige. They shared a common culture, language, and gods, yet they were like siblings vying for a parent's favor. This tension between shared identity and rivalry defined the era. Their world was a crowded, vibrant, and sometimes violent network of these brilliant, shining city-states, each a testament to what humans could achieve when they gathered together under a shared story of divine order and royal authority. But what happens when one of these city-states, or a people from outside the system, decides that one story, one authority, should stretch over all the others? The logic of the city-state contained the seed of its own transformation. The ambition it fostered would not be contained by riverbanks. The stage was set for a new actor to enter, one who would look at the map of competing cities and see not a collection of independent states, but a single, unified empire waiting to be born. The age of the city-state was glorious, but it was inherently unstable. A storm was gathering on the horizon from an unexpected direction. The world of the Sumerian city-states was a brilliant, introverted garden. Its people believed their rivers, their gods, and their rivalries defined the limits of the world. But beyond the irrigated fields and the protective deserts, other peoples watched and learned. Among them were groups of Semitic-speaking herders and traders from the arid fringes, known as the Akkadians. They moved in the spaces between the great cities, adopting Mesopotamian customs while keeping their own language and identity. They served as merchants, mercenaries, and laborers within the walls of Ur and Uruk, a growing presence waiting for a moment of weakness. That moment came with a man of legendary, almost mythical origins. Ancient tales say he was found as a baby, adrift in a reed basket on the Euphrates. History suggests he began as a royal cupbearer. His name was Sargon, and he possessed a vision that shattered the old world. He looked at the mosaic of warring city-states and did not see a natural order. He saw fragmentation, an opportunity. His genius was to unite the martial energy of his fellow Akkadians with the administrative machinery of the Sumerians, and to aim not for local dominance, but for totality. His conquest began with Uruk itself. But Sargon did not fight like a Sumerian king. The Sumerian military ideal was the heavy infantryman, clad in bronze, fighting in a solid, disciplined phalanx. Sargon's forces were built around mobility and the missile. His great innovation was the widespread use of the composite bow, a weapon of layered wood, horn, and sinew that could launch arrows with terrifying force and accuracy, piercing the bronze armor of the Sumerian lines from a safe distance. His armies were disciplined units of archers, not just individual champions. The siege of Uruk was a masterclass in this new warfare. Sargon's engineers built earthwork ramps and mobile siege towers, methods of patient, systematic pressure rather than a single valiant assault. When Uruk fell, the psychological impact reverberated through every city in the land. If mighty Uruk could be taken, no walls were safe. Sargon's subsequent campaigns were a blend of this relentless military innovation and shrewd diplomacy. He offered terms to cities that surrendered, incorporating their structures rather than destroying them. One by one, the proud city-states submitted. For the first time in history, the entire Mesopotamian plain, from the Persian Gulf to the rain-fed north, answered to a single ruler. Sargon declared himself king of the 4 quarters of the world. The empire was born. To administer this unprecedented realm, he built a new capital from scratch, Agade. Its location was strategic, near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, a hub for controlling traffic and communication. Agade was a city of government, a deliberate administrative heart. Here, Sargon and his successors crafted a new model of rule. They appointed governors from local elites to manage day-to-day affairs, but stationed Akkadian officials and garrisons to ensure loyalty. They took the cuneiform script of the Sumerians and adapted it to write their own, very different, Akkadian language, a stunning intellectual feat that preserved knowledge while expanding its reach. The Akkadian Empire became a crucible of synthesis. Art flourished, combining Sumerian forms with a new emotional realism. The famous bronze head believed to be Sargon shows a face of weathered, solemn authority, a world away from the stylized, wide-eyed statues of earlier Sumerian rulers. This was portraiture hinting at an individual mind. The empire stretched trade networks further than ever before, bringing tin from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and lapis lazuli from beyond the mountains. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, took the imperial idea to its theological extreme. Previous kings ruled by the favor of the gods. Naram-Sin declared he was a god. On his famous victory stele, he is depicted wearing the horned crown of divinity, towering over his soldiers and defeated foes, climbing a mountain under symbolic starry skies. He was no longer just a representative, he was the source of power. This was the apex of Akkadian ambition, a claim of cosmic kingship. But empires are fragile ecosystems. The very vastness that made the Akkadian state magnificent also made it vulnerable. Governing from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia stretched its administrative lines thin. Rebellions simmered in distant provinces. The professional army was exhausted by constant campaigns. And from the harsh Zagros Mountains to the east, a new and terrifying force descended, the Gudians. They were nomadic warriors, unlike any enemy the empire had faced. They fought from horseback with ruthless mobility, having no cities to besiege, no fixed pattern to predict. They were a storm that could not be walled out. The overextended Akkadian military machine, designed to break city walls and disciplined infantry, was ill-suited to fight a whirlwind. The Gutian invasions shattered the empire, plunging Mesopotamia into a dark age of fragmentation and chaos. Cities were sacked, canals fell into disrepair, and the unifying vision of Agade crumbled into dust. The great experiment in universal rule appeared to have failed. The light of civilization, it seemed, might flicker and go out. Yet, in the rubble, embers glowed. One Sumerian city-state, Lagash, managed to navigate the turmoil. Under its ruler, Gudea, it pursued a path of peaceful internal development and cautious diplomacy with the Gutian overlords. Gudea focused not on conquest, but on revival. He became a patron of the arts and a builder of temples. His statues, carved from rare, hard diorite with exquisite care, show a serene, contemplative ruler, not a warrior. They are covered in inscriptions detailing his pious constructions, a deliberate effort to preserve and recommit to Sumerian culture and the favor of the gods. Lagash became a sanctuary, proving that the spirit of Mesopotamian civilization could endure even imperial collapse. The Gutian interlude, however, could not last. Their loose, predatory style was poor for long-term governance. As their grip weakened, a yearning for the old order, for unity and stability, grew among the Sumerian cities. The stage was set for a renaissance, for a leader who could expel the invaders and rebuild not just a city, but an ideal. From the sacred city of Ur, a new architect of order would arise. He would study the lessons of both Sargon's imperial overreach and the Dark Age that followed, aiming to build something lasting. The pendulum of history was about to swing back, not to simple city-states, but toward a new, more resilient vision of empire. The recovery was coming, and it would forge a legacy written not just in clay, but in law. From the ashes of collapse, a new order began to take shape. The Gutian invaders, masters of destruction, had no blueprint for building. As their loose hold on the land slackened, a deep-seated longing for stability and familiar gods stirred in the heart of Sumer. The cities, weary of chaos, began to look for a unifier, a restorer. They found him not in a warrior of brutal conquest, but in a governor and administrator from the revered city of Ur. His name was Urnemu, and his mission was not merely to conquer, but to reconstruct, to build a kingdom that could withstand the tests of time. His rise was strategic. He understood the military lessons of the past, fielding disciplined armies with improved bronze weapons and sophisticated siege tactics. But his true genius lay in what he did after the fighting stopped. He did not seek to rule a vast, unwieldy territory like Sargon, but to create a cohesive, well-governed state in the Sumerian heartland. His conquests were calculated, first securing the great cities like Uruk, then methodically bringing others under a new kind of authority. His power was rooted in something more durable than fear. It was rooted in law. Around 2100 BCE, Urnamo promulgated a decree that would echo through millennia. It is the world's oldest known comprehensive law code. Imagine the impact of this concept. For ages, disputes were settled by tradition, local custom, or the whim of the powerful. Now, for the first time, a ruler declared that justice should be standardized, written down, and applicable to all within his realm. His code established principles that still underpin our legal thinking. It focused heavily on civil matters, disputes over property, irrigation rights, marriage, and inheritance. Its famous principle was restitution, not blind vengeance. If a man destroyed another's eye, he paid a fine in silver. The law aimed to repair the social fabric, not just punish. This was revolutionary governance. It provided predictability. A merchant knew the rules of contract enforcement. A farmer knew his rights to water. A woman knew her standing in marriage and divorce. By creating this framework, Urnamo wasn't just ruling people, he was building a society based on mutual understanding and order. His code required a professional judiciary to interpret it, scribes to record proceedings, and standardized weights and measures to ensure fairness in every transaction. Administration became a science. His vision extended to the physical realm. He initiated monumental construction, most famously the Great Ziggurat of Ur. This was not just a temple, it was a symbol of the revival. A massive stepped pyramid of baked brick, it rose high above the plain, a dazzling white beacon declaring that the gods had returned to their proper homes and order was restored. Its construction was itself an administrative marvel, requiring the coordination of thousands of workers, precise brickmaking, and sophisticated engineering to manage weight and drainage. It stood as a testament to what coordinated human effort, under just law, could achieve. Uarnamu's son, Shulgi, inherited this well-built machine and refined it over a reign of nearly 5 decades. Under Shulgi, the Neo-Sumerian, or UR3, state reached its zenith of bureaucratic sophistication. He transformed the army into a professional standing force. He established a vast network of provincial governors, tax collectors, and record keepers. The state managed everything: massive herds of livestock at central distribution centers like Drahem, where every sheep and cow was accounted for, workshops producing standardized textiles and ceramics, and granaries that fed the workers on state projects. The archives from this period are breathtaking in their detail. Tablets record the daily output of a single weaver, the amount of wool issued to a workshop, the rations for a child laborer, the travel expenses of a messenger. It was a world monitored, measured, and managed. This hyper-organized system generated immense wealth and stability, funding majestic projects and supporting a flourishing of Sumerian literature. It was during this time that the great epics, like the Tales of Gilgamesh, were compiled and standardized in the scribal schools, preserving the collective memory and imagination of the people. Yet, this very strength contained a hidden fragility. The system was immensely costly. The professional bureaucracy and army were a constant drain on the economy. The state's grip was so tight it could stifle local initiative. And on the edges of this carefully irrigated garden, new pressures were building. Nomadic Amorite tribes from the western deserts, Semitic-speaking like the Akkadians before them, began to settle on the fringes of the empire. They were initially absorbed as laborers and mercenaries, but their numbers grew. Simultaneously, the Elamites from the Iranian highlands eyed the rich lowlands with envy. The end of the UR3 state came not with a single battle, but with a slow unraveling. The burdens of the centralized system grew heavy. The Amorites, once subjects, began to establish their own independent towns. The last king, Ibisin, found his authority leaking away as provinces stopped sending taxes and governors acted on their own. Then the external blow fell. The Elamites swept in from the east, capturing Ur itself around 2004 BC. The poet who lamented the city's fall wrote hauntingly of its temples destroyed, its people scattered, and its gods abandoned. The great ziggurat stood silent. Once again, Mesopotamia fragmented, but the template for civilization was now indelible. The Amorite settlers did not destroy the culture, they coveted it. They adopted Mesopotamian gods, cuneiform writing, and architectural styles. In the political vacuum, new Amorite-led city-states arose, competing for dominance. One of these was a hitherto minor town on the Euphrates, advantageously located at the crossroads of north-south and east-west trade. Its name was Babylon. For over a century after Ur's fall, Babylon was just one among many rivals. Its early kings focused on consolidating local power, building alliances, and controlling trade routes. They were patient. They learned from the past, from the overreach of Akkad, from the bureaucratic brilliance and brittleness of Ur. They bided their time, watching as the larger powers like Larsa and Isin wrestled for supremacy. Then, in 1792 BC, a king ascended the Babylonian throne who would synthesize all of Mesopotamia's hard-won lessons into a final, enduring masterpiece of ancient statecraft. His name was Hammurabi. He would take the tools of law, administration, and military might and forge an empire whose legacy would be written not just in clay, but in stone, for all time to see. The age of the lawgiver was about to reach its pinnacle. In the simmering political landscape of a divided Mesopotamia, Babylon's moment arrived. Its king, Hammurabi, began his reign as a careful player in a complex game of rivals. For the first decades, he was a diplomat and a strategist, strengthening his city's walls and forging alliances. He watched as the powerful kingdoms of Larsa, Eshnunna, and Assyria jockeyed for position, waiting for his opportunity. He understood that true power lay not just in winning battles, but in crafting a system that would last. When he finally moved, it was with decisive, systematic campaigns that showcased a new level of military and logistical planning. He didn't just want to defeat his enemies. He aimed to eliminate them as rivals and absorb their territories seamlessly. His conquest of the prestigious city of Uruk sent a symbolic message. The mantle of Sumerian glory was passing to Babylon. His northern campaign against Assyria was a logistical marvel, maintaining supply lines over hundreds of miles to besiege its formidable capital. One by one, the major centers fell. By the end of his 43-year reign, Hammurabi ruled a unified Mesopotamia that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the foothills of Anatolia. He called himself the king who made the 4 quarters of the world obedient. But his true legacy was not the empire itself. It was the operating system he designed for it. That system is immortalized on a black basalt stele, a stone monument over 2 meters tall. At its top, Hammurabi is depicted standing before the seated sun god Shamash, the god of justice. He is receiving the symbols of royal authority, a visual declaration that his laws are divinely inspired. Below this scene are carved 282 legal provisions. This is the Code of Hammurabi, the most sophisticated and comprehensive legal document of the ancient world. The code's famous eye for an eye principle is often misunderstood. It was not a license for brutality, but a limitation, a law of proportional justice designed to prevent endless blood feuds. If a man caused the death of another's daughter, his own daughter would be put to death. Harsh to modern senses, it was a revolutionary attempt to standardize punishment and replace clan vengeance with state-administered justice. But the code was far more than criminal law. It was a detailed blueprint for society. It meticulously regulated every aspect of Babylonian life. What was the rent for a field? How should a physician be paid for a successful operation? And what was the penalty for a failed one that led to death? What were the responsibilities of a builder if a house he constructed collapsed? How were inheritance disputes between sons of different wives to be settled? The code covered commerce, agriculture, family law, and professional liability with astonishing thoroughness. It recognized different social classes, the noble, the commoner, and the slave, and prescribed different penalties and rights for each, cementing a structured social hierarchy into law. This vast legal framework demanded a professional class to run it: judges, scribes, and administrators. It created predictability. A merchant in Babylon could enter a contract with a partner in Ur, confident that the law would protect his investment. The code stabilized economic life, which in turn fueled prosperity. Babylon became the undisputed commercial and cultural capital of the world. Its scribal schools attracted the best minds, preserving ancient literature and advancing new knowledge in mathematics and astronomy. Hammurabi's reign was a golden age of centralization and cultural brilliance. Yet, the very nature of empire carries within it the seeds of change. After his death, the immense bureaucratic state he built began to show cracks. Maintaining control over such a vast territory required constant energy and resourcefulness from its rulers. Later kings struggled with restive provinces, economic pressures, and new threats from the periphery. The Hittites, a rising power from Anatolia with iron weapons, began to probe at the northern frontiers. From the eastern mountains, the Kassites, another nomadic people, applied steady pressure. The first Babylonian dynasty slowly eroded, its central authority weakening until it could no longer hold the line. Around 1595 BC, a lightning raid by the Hittite king Mursili I reached Babylon itself, sacking the city and carrying away its patron god Marduk's statue. This was a profound spiritual and political catastrophe. The dynasty collapsed, and for centuries, Babylon was ruled by foreign Kassite kings who, though they adopted Babylonian culture, presided over a period of relative stagnation. Mesopotamia entered another era of regionalism and reduced grandeur. But the idea of Babylon, as a symbol of supreme kingship, cosmic order, and divine favor, never died. It lingered in the collective memory, a dream of a perfect, ordered world under one legitimate ruler. The city itself remained a great religious and cultural center. And in the north, in the rugged lands of Assyria along the Tigris, a different kind of power was incubating. The Assyrians had always been a tougher, more militaristic people, shaped by a landscape less generous than the alluvial south. They absorbed Mesopotamian culture but retained a ferocious warrior ethos. For centuries, they existed as a kingdom often subordinate to Babylonian or other powers. But they were learning, adapting, and storing a deep well of resentment and ambition. They watched as empires rose and fell, and they studied the mechanics of power, the law, the administration, the siegecraft. They concluded that Hammurabi's system, for all its justice, lacked one crucial element: relentless, overwhelming military force as the primary engine of the state. They decided to build an empire not on a code of laws, but on a doctrine of terror and precision. While Babylon slept on its legacy, Assyria was forging the instruments of a new, terrifying age. The next masters of Mesopotamia would not carry a law code. They would carry a sword, a spear, and an iron will. The calm order of the lawgiver was about to give way to the thunder of the warrior kings. From the northern highlands, where the Tigris carved its path through less forgiving terrain, a new force gathered its strength. The Assyrians had long lived in the shadow of southern powers, but their character was hardened by a land that offered no easy bounty. They were farmers, yes, but also hunters and warriors by necessity. While Babylon refined its laws, Assyria perfected its weapons. It was not a civilization of philosophers first, but of soldiers. And when it finally turned its gaze outward, the world would shudder. The transformation began in earnest under Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BC. He looked at the old model of part-time levies and seasonal campaigns and found it wanting. He envisioned something unprecedented: a professional, standing army, a permanent instrument of the state. This was not just a reform, it was a revolution in organization. Soldiers were paid, equipped, and trained year-round, creating a force of unmatched discipline and readiness. But the tools of this force were what truly changed history. The Assyrian advantage was iron. While bronze was prized, iron ore was more abundant, and when worked properly, it produced weapons that were harder, sharper, and more durable. Assyrian smiths became masters of the forge, producing not just swords, but standardized gear for thousands: helmets, scale armor, spear points, and arrowheads. Their armies glinted not with bronze's golden hue, but with the cold, gray sheen of iron. This technological edge was terrifying to opponents still reliant on older metals. Yet their true genius was in siegecraft. Earlier armies might starve a city out or scale its walls with ladders under a hail of stones. The Assyrians engineered submission. They built massive, wheeled battering rams housed in protective towers, their iron-tipped heads pounding relentlessly at gate and wall. They constructed sophisticated siege mounds, earthen ramps built precisely to the height of the battlements, allowing troops to storm across. They dug tunnels to undermine foundations. Their relief sculptures showed these machines in chilling detail, not as miracles, but as standard equipment, the product of an institutionalized engineering corps. Cavalry, once used primarily for scouting, was transformed into a shock force. Assyrian horsemen, often working in pairs with one holding shields for both while the other wielded a bow or spear, could maneuver and strike with devastating speed. Combined with infantry archers and armored spearmen, the Assyrian military machine was a combined arms juggernaut. designed to break any resistance with systematic, brutal efficiency. But conquest is one thing, control is another. Here, Assyria displayed its most chilling innovation, a policy of calculated terror and mass deportation. When a city rebelled, the punishment was exemplary and horrific. Captured leaders were often flayed alive, impaled on stakes outside the city walls. Populations were not simply subjugated, they were uprooted. Thousands upon thousands of people, from Israel, Babylon, Aram, Elam, were forcibly marched across the empire and resettled in foreign lands. This served a cold, logical purpose. It broke the cultural and familial bonds that fueled rebellion, mixed populations to prevent unified opposition, and relocated skilled workers to where the empire needed them. It was social engineering on a monstrous scale. Under kings like Sargon II and Sennacherib, the empire expanded to its grotesque zenith. It stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Nile Delta, from Anatolia to the mountains of Iran. The great cities of the age, Damascus, Memphis, Babylon itself, all bowed to the king in the new, monstrously grand capital of Nineveh. Sennacherib's palace, there was a deliberate assertion of dominance, its walls covered in mile upon mile of stone reliefs depicting in graphic detail his victories. Cities burning, prisoners groveling, rivers running red. This was history as propaganda, written in stone and terror. Yet, within this engine of conquest, a profound paradox flourished. The same Assyrian kings who ordered massacres also harbored a deep, almost obsessive reverence for the ancient Mesopotamian past. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian ruler, was the epitome of this contradiction. A ruthless campaigner who crushed Elam and Egypt, he was also a scholarly bibliophile. In his palace at Nineveh, he assembled the greatest library the ancient world had ever known. He sent scribes to every corner of the empire with a simple, staggering order: copy everything. Tens of thousands of clay tablets were gathered, epic poems like Gilgamesh, medical texts, astronomical observations, religious hymns, dictionaries, and administrative manuals. Ashurbanipal sought to possess, in one place, the entire accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamia. His library was an act of cultural conquest as total as his military campaigns, an attempt to own not just the land, but the very mind of civilization. On some tablets, he even added a colophon: I, Ashurbanipal, king of the universe. I wrote upon tablets the wisdom of the god of scribes. I placed them for the future in the library. He was building a fortress for knowledge, even as the political fortress around it began to crack. For the empire's very success bred its own enemies. The constant campaigns drained resources and manpower. The brutal suppression of Babylon created a deep, festering hatred. The vast, forcibly mixed population had little loyalty to their overlords. And on the periphery, new powers gathered: the Medes in the Iranian plateau and the revitalized Babylonians in the south, chafing under Assyrian rule. When the end came, it was cataclysmic. A coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others laid siege to Nineveh in 612 BC. The accounts describe a siege lasting months, the great rivers being turned against the city's walls, and a final, savage sack. The palaces were burned, the reliefs smashed, the great library buried under collapsing masonry. The world's first true military superpower was erased from the earth with a thoroughness it had so often inflicted on others. In the smoldering silence that followed, one power rose from the ashes not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. The Babylonians, led by a new dynasty, looked upon the ruined landscape and saw not an end, but an opportunity, a chance to reclaim their ancient glory and build a city so magnificent it would become a legend. The age of the Iron Fist was over. The next chapter would be written in glazed blue brick and gold, a final, breathtaking monument to the Mesopotamian dream before the curtain finally fell. The night of Assyria had passed, and a last, glorious dawn was breaking over Babylon. From the smoke and rubble of Assyria's collapse, a familiar power re-emerged, purified by fire and filled with a vengeful ambition. The Babylonians had endured the heel of the northerners for too long. Now, with the Medes as allies, they had torn the oppressor down. The man who would harness this resurgent energy was Nebuchadnezzar II. His father, Nabopolassar, had led the rebellion. Nebuchadnezzar's task was different, not to destroy, but to rebuild. And he would not just restore Babylon. He would transform it into a wonder, a city so magnificent its name would become synonymous with splendor itself. His reign began with securing the empire he had inherited. Campaigns into the Levant, most famously the siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC, demonstrated that Babylonian military prowess, learned in part from their Assyrian masters, remained formidable. But Nebuchadnezzar's lasting passion was not for endless conquest, but for construction. He looked at his capital and envisioned a metropolis that would stun the senses and proclaim the god's favor for all time. He launched the most ambitious building program the ancient world had ever seen. The city's defenses were his first concern. He enclosed Babylon within a double circuit of walls so massive they were counted among the wonders of the world. The inner wall was broad enough for a chariot to turn upon its battlements. Beyond these, a mighty moat filled from the Euphrates completed an impregnable barrier. But these walls were more than military, they were a psychological statement. Within this vast, protected space, security and order reigned. The chaos of the outside world was held at bay. At the heart of this ordered world was a processional way of breathtaking artistry. This was the main artery of the city, used during the Great New Year's festival when the statue of the god Marduk would be paraded. Nebuchadnezzar paved this sacred road with great slabs of white limestone and red breccia. But it was the walls flanking it that stole the breath. They were faced with glazed bricks of a luminous, deep blue. Against this celestial background marched reliefs of over 100 golden-maned lions, the sacred animal of the goddess Ishtar. The effect in the bright Mesopotamian sun must have been dazzling, a river of color and power flowing through the city. This way led to the Ishtar Gate, the main entrance to the inner city. The gate itself was a monumental arch of that same brilliant blue, adorned with rows of alternating bulls and dragons, symbols of the weather god Adad and the god Marduk. These were not carved stone, but molded glazed brick, each creature formed from dozens of precisely shaped and colored pieces. The technology to produce these glazes, vibrant blues from cobalt, whites, yellows, and fire them uniformly was a state secret, a pinnacle of craft and chemistry. The gate was not just an entrance, it was a portal into another realm, a testament to human ability to create beauty from earth and fire. Within these walls, tradition speaks of another marvel, the Hanging Gardens. Ancient writers described a towering artificial mountain of terraces, overflowing with trees and exotic plants, irrigated by hidden pumps drawing water from the river below. They were said to have been built for a homesick queen who missed the green hills of her homeland. Whether they were a literal reality or a poetic amalgamation of Babylon's many garden parks and advanced engineering, the legend persists. It speaks to the city's reputation as a place where human will could reshape nature into paradise, where the impossible was made manifest. This was the Neo-Babylonian Empire at its peak, staggeringly wealthy, culturally confident, and divinely sanctioned. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions boast of his works, for the astonishment of all peoples. The city became a cosmic magnet, drawing in deportees like the exiled Jews, who brought their own traditions and whose writings would preserve the memory of Babylon in scripture. It attracted scholars who advanced the ancient sciences. Babylonian astronomers, building on millennia of observation, could now predict lunar eclipses and planetary movements with remarkable accuracy. Their mathematical system, based on 60, still governs our minutes and hours. But empires, even those of brick and gold, obey their own rhythms. Nebuchadnezzar's magnificent city was the brilliant, final flowering of a native Mesopotamian civilization that had been growing for 3,000 years. It was the last act. After his death, the dynasty faltered. His successors lacked his vigor and vision. The last king, Nabonidus, was an antiquarian eccentric, more interested in excavating ancient temples and promoting the moon god Sin than in governing. He spent years away from Babylon in an Arabian oasis, leaving the administration in disarray. While Babylon turned inward, gazing at its own glorious past, a new power was consolidating in the arid highlands to the east. The Persians, under the leadership of a strategic genius named Cyrus, were forging a different kind of empire, one based not on terrifying conquest or overwhelming monument building, but on flexibility, tolerance, and efficient administration. They studied the lessons of their predecessors. Assyria's brutality had bred hatred. Babylon's centralized grandeur had bred a brittle arrogance. Cyrus understood that to rule a diverse world, you had to allow it to breathe. His approach was to present himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator and a restorer of order. When he turned his attention to Babylon, the great city was politically divided, its king unpopular with the powerful priests of Marduk. Cyrus's agents had already done their work, promising restoration to the disaffected. In 539 BCE, the Persian army approached Babylon. According to the chronicles, they diverted the Euphrates and entered the city through the riverbed gates, which had been left open. There was no great siege, no final apocalyptic battle. The empire, weary and fractured, simply acquiesced. Cyrus entered not as a conqueror, but as a king. He famously issued a decree, recorded on the Cyrus cylinder, portraying himself as Marduk's chosen instrument to restore proper worship and peace. He allowed deported peoples, like the Jews, to return home. He kept Babylon as a great capital, but within a new, larger system. The fall of Babylon was not a crash, but a gentle absorption. The independent political history of Mesopotamia, the story that began with the first mud brick walls of Uruk, had come to an end. The civilization did not die. It was metabolized into something larger. The cuneiform script would slowly fade, replaced by the more versatile Aramaic alphabet. But the knowledge, the stories, the laws, and the astronomical charts were preserved, copied, and passed on. The great river of Mesopotamian achievement now flowed into the wider sea of world history. The cradle had nurtured its children, and now they were stepping out into a broader world, carrying the legacy of the first civilization with them into the future. And so, the great will turn one final time. The mighty city of Babylon, its blue gates still gleaming, now answered to a distant capital in the Persian highlands. The change was profound, yet strangely quiet. There was no ruin, no sack, no silencing of the gods. Instead, a new, pragmatic order settled over the ancient land. The Persian Empire, vast and diverse, had little need to erase what worked. Why dismantle the efficient Babylonian administrative machine, or tear down its temples? Cyrus and his successors were architects of incorporation. They kept the local officials, respected the ancient gods, though they might add a few of their own, and collected their taxes with systematic calm. Mesopotamia remained wealthy, its fields fertile, its scribes busy. But the center of gravity had irrevocably shifted. This was the beginning of a long twilight, a gradual blending. The cuneiform script, that intricate, wedge-shaped language of kings and accountants, faced a quiet rival, the Aramaic alphabet. Used by merchants and administrators across the Persian Empire, it was faster to learn and easier to write on papyrus or parchment. Slowly, over generations, the ancient clay tablets gave way to scrolls. The vast temples still trained scribes in the old ways for religious texts, but for a merchant drafting a contract or a governor sending a report, Aramaic was simply more practical. The very knowledge of how to read the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Code of Hammurabi became the domain of a shrinking priesthood, a specialized art rather than a living skill. Can you hear the quiet in those last scriptoriums? The sound of a 3,000-year conversation beginning to whisper into silence. Yet, the light of Mesopotamian wisdom did not go out. It was translated, carried, and scattered. Persian administrators valued the precise Babylonian mathematics for surveying lands and calculating taxes. They relied on Babylonian astronomical tables to maintain their calendars across a realm that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. The knowledge was too useful to lose. It was repackaged, adapted, and sent along the imperial roads. Then came a new conqueror, one who brought the fire of Greek ambition. Alexander the Great, standing in the shadow of the ziggurat at Babylon, saw not just a conquered city, but the source of an ancient, venerable knowledge. He dreamed of making Babylon his eastern capital, a fusion point of worlds. His early death shattered that plan, but his successors, the Hellenistic kings, continued the work of synthesis. In the great library of Alexandria, far to the west, scholars pored over texts that had traveled from Mesopotamia. Babylonian star catalogs informed Greek astronomy. Their sexagesimal math influenced geometry. The epic tales of heroes and floods seeped into the Mediterranean imagination. Later still, with the rise of the Islamic caliphates, another wave of preservation crested. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a city itself reborn near ancient Babylon, became a beacon of learning. Caliphs sponsored the translation of countless scientific and philosophical works from Greek, Persian, and Syriac into Arabic. And within those Greek texts lay the absorbed wisdom of Mesopotamia. Islamic scholars, building on this fused foundation, advanced algebra, astronomy, and medicine to new heights. The distant echo of a Sumerian accountant calculation or an Assyrian astronomer's observation now resonated in the work of scholars with names like Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Battani. The legacy was no longer a distinct river, but a deep aquifer feeding many streams. So, what remains of that first civilization? Not just broken bricks in desert tells. Its legacy is woven into the fabric of our world, often in ways we no longer see. Look at the clock on your wall. That division of hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds? That is the sexagesimal system of the Sumerians and Babylonians, chosen for its mathematical elegance. The 360 degrees of a circle? The same source. Every time you check the time or consider an angle, you are touching the mind of ancient Mesopotamia. Consider the concept of written law. The idea that rules for society should be publicly displayed, standardized, and administered by the state. This began with Ur-Nammu and reached its early apex with Hammurabi. Our own legal traditions, though infinitely evolved, stand on that foundational principle of codified justice. The very structure of a city, with its specialized districts, its public works, its bureaucratic management, was first worked out between the Tigris and Euphrates. Their stories are our stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its themes of friendship, the fear of death, the search for meaning, and the Great Flood, speaks to concerns as fresh today as they were 4,000 years ago. It reminds us that the human heart, in its joys and its sorrows, has changed very little across the millennia. The ruins of ziggurats now stand silent under the stars, but the ambitions they represented, to reach for the divine, to create order from chaos, to leave a mark that endures, still drive us. The first farmers who looked at a river flood and saw not just water, but potential, initiated a chain of innovation that has never stopped. They taught us to plant tomorrow's food, to build for a future we may not see, to write down our thoughts so they might outlive us. The story of Mesopotamia is the story of beginnings. It is our collective prologue. And as this long tale now closes, let that be the thought to carry with you into sleep. We are all heirs to that ancient cradle. The rhythms they established, of work and rest, of community and law, of looking up at the stars and wondering, still beat within our own world. Their night has long since fallen, but the dawn they helped create is the one in which we still live. Thank you for listening to this peaceful journey to the dawn of history. If you'd like to drift off to more stories of the ancient world, myths, or forgotten sciences, consider subscribing to Sleepy Owl for a fresh journey each time you need to unwind. Sleep well and dream of deep time.